Hello everyone, welcome back to another Sunday. Today is my 40th episode, so blessings to all of you who have had the courage, wisdom, or stupidity to follow me along this entire path from the beginning. Thank the Lord, all of us, that we have passed through 2020 and we have now arrived in 2021. And I'm hoping that some of the crazy magic that we have been attempting to do with our mind links have contributed perhaps to some of that. So putting on my wizard's hat here, all of us should put on a wizard's hat and congratulate ourselves for moving into the 21st century and removing the crazy, insane influences that are now passing out with the new ones passing in. That said, I want to just do what I always do here. This is where you can get the soundtrack for today, scientificsounds.com/Pangaea. If you wish to make a comment or ask a question, this is the place to go. Scientific Sounds /Ask a Question. And here is where you go to find all of the previous live streams all the way back to April 5th. And just make sure it's Dr. Thompson Live is the D and the T and the L are capitalized. So today we're talking about our own Mother Earth and its own birth process. And we're also going to go on a kind of a crazy ride through strange stories and wild theories about Earth, about our own Mother Earth. And when we begin this process, way back in the beginning, the beginning, by the way, of everything, most of the spiritual religious traditions on various cultures on Earth have some version of the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God. And, you know, of course, my joke is that in the beginning was the Word, but language hadn't been invented yet, so the joke was on us. But when we pick this apart as we go through, every religion has some version of this, of in the beginning was the Word, the sound. In the beginning was the sound. Because what is a word anyway? It's just air blowing across vocal cords making a sound that gets manipulated by your mouth into words that we have ascribed meaning to these various types of sounds. And that's how we communicate with each other, by shooting packets of shaped sound waves at each other, sound waves of meaning. But the original in the beginning was the Word. As I've described before, for each of us, we have our own beginning. And we have our own beginning with the Word or the sound, because at 16 to 24 weeks, when the fetus brain and neurodevelopment first brings all five senses online, the only sense collecting information is sound and vibration. So yes, for each of us, the very first thing in the beginning for each of us was the sound, was the Word. Probably no surprise why the great religions have pulled that, because it all comes from human beings. They're the ones who have written these, quote, sacred works inspired supposedly by God. But you're the closest to God when you're in the womb. You've just arrived from there. So I think it's no mistake that all the great religions have this same thing in common, that all of us as individuals have in common, that the first thing we experienced was the Word, the sound, the vibration. The Word before meaning, the word before language. And each of us experiences our own Big Bang. And, you know, before the senses come online, our consciousness arrives in this newly formed body and populates it, so to speak. At some point, each one of us wakes up in the void, and we don't know who we are or where we are, and we don't have language to describe it. We have thoughts without form, thoughts without language. We are here in the present moment. Who am I? Where am I? And each of these cultures on Earth, and each one of us privately, has our own Genesis story. In the beginning was the Word. Our own story of the creation. In the religious traditions, I was brought up as a Christian, so I'm well familiar with the Christian version of Genesis. In the beginning was the Word, and then there was light. And just like in the third trimester, when the belly is stretched enough, large enough, and thin enough that light can actually penetrate through. So you do begin to see the first indications of light later on in the third trimester. So in the Christian tradition, in the beginning was the Word, the vibration, and then there was light. God divided the light from the darkness. Similar thing that happens within the womb in miniature for each of us. But when we go back to our culture, every culture has its Genesis story, and our present culture has the Genesis story beginning with the Big Bang. And it's sort of like the modern church is the church of science, and the modern priesthood are the scientists. And they have their own version of the Genesis story. And it may or may not be correct. I have deep questions about the fact that there was a Big Bang, that something came from nothing, even though there is the possibility, just from the standpoint of quantum science, that if you have an infinite universe that has been there forever, then it's just a numbers game. It's a statistical numbers game. Statistically, there is the probability that something could arrive from nothing. Improbable as possible, but it is possible. And if you have infinity to roll the numbers, then it is assured, because it's forever, because you have an infinite amount of time to roll the dice until they come up with something coming from nothing. So yes, that's possible. The question of if there's a Big Bang, what came before the Big Bang, where we have the multi-universe theory, where our Big Bang could have been the collision of two, reality-sized black holes, or it could have been two universes colliding together, or a multiplicity of different explanations. That's just one. The one that our current scientific priesthood has come up with and has adopted is this idea of the Big Bang, which began to cool and form, atomic structures and atoms, and then form, gas clouds and galaxies and stars and planets. And here we are at the point where, planets begin to get formed at, all these like 1,000 million years, and some kind of a time scale in our own Genesis story. And then we get to planetary formation. The planets are still balls of molten rock. So our own planet, our beloved planet Earth, our own mother, began this way, as a molten ball of rock, being struck by countless meteors and remoltenized and on and on. This is part of our scientific priesthood Genesis story, where the young Earth was a molten fire pit that was slowly cooling, so that eventually we had some, dried slag with rivers of molten lava constantly being struck by meteors and asteroids and planetary chunks and debris and everything else. And of course it was thought that those asteroids and those planetary fragments and other giant fragments of things that were striking the Earth, comets from deep space, were the ones who carried water. Part of our scientific genesis story is that Earth was populated with water from being struck by ice meteorites, which, as everything cooled, started to form these hot pools, the primordial ooze, where whatever it was that took place that took organic molecules and turned them into DNA and RNA and started to form primitive life, primitive cellular structures in the in the primordial soup, so to speak. And eventually we have these single cell organisms that are waking up and being alive, and at some magic point these single-celled organisms begin to combine together and form symbiotic multicellular organisms that eventually became you and me. But 4.5 billion years ago, in the primordial soup, something happened. Something important happened. Nobody knows why or what it was that made the change. But single-cell organisms began to understand that it was a better survival solution to band together in colonies of symbiotic relationships with large groups of other cells and combine colonies together, and that was a better survival solution than direct competition. And now here we are as mega structural multicellular organisms in a state of balanced homeostatic symbiosis. And as multicellular organisms on Earth, we're now returning to what we saw in the primordial soup. We're duking it out for the food morsels as multicellular organisms. And what we need now is a big change to take place. And I believe that the first one was supplied and the second one has to be conscious, that we need to wake up to the idea that it is better to combine our forces in a grand planet-wide symbiotic relationship with one another and all life on the planet and the planet itself and the cosmos in a new dispensation of evolution of the consciousness of our species, to reawaken to a grand symbiotic relationship with one another. And one way that I'm doing my little part is with these mind links, where we're linking our consciousnesses together in a grand pool of synchronized conscious state. And a synchronized conscious state through science and brain entrainment and binaural beats to synchronize up where the ideas come through, magnify our consciousness so that we can tap into higher dimensions of information and power that no one person would ever have access to. Once again, by symbiosis, we have the chance to make change. And hopefully, it's working. In the 21st century, where 2021 has now seen the positive change, we are moving forward. So hopefully, the little efforts that we are all making is paying off somehow. So this, these multicellular organisms, now we have this whole timeline in the Genesis story of the Church of Science that we all have learned in school and more or less subscribe to because of fossil records and leading up through the evolutionary phases to us over here, and where we're stepping next is unknown, but there are people who seem to have a good handle and a good track record for predicting what that's going to be. So, as I discussed before with Ray Kurzweil and a number of other futurists, and when we look at our own planet back in the beginning, where the planet was a molten ball of rock that cooled off and had asteroids and comets with water, helped to cool it off, forming an atmosphere, forming life, and we had one massive, gigantic continent of solid land that eventually began to break up, and that formed the continents and the continental plates as this massive single chunk of continent broke up into various pieces. And this original gigantic single continent was called Pangaea. And it began to break apart across these fracture lines and separate out into larger and larger areas between these plates. Because when you take the present Earth as it is and you push all these together, you can see they nicely fit. So that was where this kind of idea came from. If we move all these continents back together, they all fit nicely together and form an original continent that they call Pangaea. Why this happened, God knows. But this man had an explanation that is different from everyone else. His theory of the expanding Earth and neutrinos. Now, this guy, Dr. Konstantin Mail, I studied with this guy. He's a Russian scientist who's the world expert in scalar waves. And I had a whole broadcast on scalar waves and subtle energy fields where I discussed him a bit more and scalar waves in general. His ideas are pretty profound, and he's a top-notch scientist from Russia, so as not to be discounted out of hand. Many of the things that he's talking about are difficult to test, although he has created devices that prove the existence of scalar waves. One of the easy ones is to take your cell phone and put it in a Faraday cage where it cannot receive electromagnetic signals, and give it a phone call and see if it rings, because the only thing that could be making it ring at that point is scalar wave communication, and scalar waves spin off of radio waves and electromagnetic field waves and everything else, so it's all related together. So his experiment was to put your cell phone in a scalar wave, in a Faraday cage box that you have at home that you don't know about, and that's your microwave. The microwave is a Faraday cage because you have to contain all of those microwaves, and so they can't get out to cook your brain and your organs. So it's a very tight Faraday cage box. So you stick your cell phone in there, don't turn the machine on. Stick your phone in there and see if you can call it. And if it rings, it's scalar waves. So his theory was that the original ball of rock that solidified into a huge planet-wide continent that began to have water on it, and the height of the continent formed mountains, and the low-lying regions began to get filled with water. And as it cooled, two things were happening. His idea in a nutshell, by the way, is that here's the giant continent, and the Earth is expanding in size like a balloon blowing up. And as the expansion of the Earth takes place, these continents naturally would separate from each other because the surface of the Earth is larger now, and the original single continent is being broken apart as the size of the Earth diameter gets larger and larger. In this diagram, we can see one gigantic continent that is slowly starting to crack open as the size and the diameter of the Earth expands. Cracks appear along the natural fault lines, and eventually these continents separate further and further from each other as the diameter of the Earth gets larger. This is a compelling idea because this explains why these continents separated from a single mass. And the Pangaea idea of this being Pangaea, which cracks open into all these continents because the Earth is expanding, is a much more powerful logical idea than how come these continents of the single Pangaea just kind of drifted apart when the Earth was just the same diameter. How come that happened? This explains it quite nicely. Why? Why was it expanding? And this is this guy's idea. It has to do with a magical thing called neutrinos. And neutrinos are strange. Neutrinos are a mystery particle that scientists have been trying to capture a neutrino now for decades. And they've built these mammoth capturing caverns, highly engineered, massive, gigantic 100-meter spheres that are filled with this heavy water fluid and with all these sensors to capture a neutrino. Neutrino is thought to have no mass. And neutrinos come from the sun. The explosive power of the plasma furnace of the sun and the solar wind coming out is chock full of trillions and trillions of neutrinos coming out. And those neutrinos, because they have no mass and they're so small, pass through everything in the universe and collide with nothing. For instance, they can go through, there are trillions of neutrinos passing through your body every second. And they're so small and they have no mass that they pass through everything, including your atoms, without touching. But it doesn't explain a lot of the mysterious things that we see in the universe. And when Konstantin Meyer came in and said that, neutrinos actually do have mass, they're not completely massless. They do have a slight amount of mass. And that was recently confirmed with the capture of a neutrino in one of these detectors, which began to confirm what Konstantin Meyer had been talking about. And the interesting thing about these neutrinos, since there's trillions and trillions every instant coming throughout the universe from the stars in the universe, these neutrinos streaming out from the sun are passing right through the planet Earth, plus all of our bodies. They go all the way through the entire mass of the Earth and don't touch anything. But there is something that has to do with the structure of the Earth, where we have, the crust that is solidified, and underneath that is the mantle, and as we get further down into the middle of the Earth, the mass of weight of all this material causes it to get hotter and hotter and hotter, and things get molten. That's where all the molten rock is, the lava. And at the core, what happens is this molten rock, the heavier metals sink to the bottom and the lighter metals come to the surface. So the heaviest metals, particularly iron, ends up in the core. That's why we say that we've got an iron core to the planet, which is spinning, which generates a magnetic field. That's why we have a magnetic envelope around our planet. But according to physics, we have these four states of matter, right? We've got a solid, a liquid, a gas, and a fourth state of matter called a plasma. And a plasma is a super highly energetic form of matter, and it's plasma that comes out from the solar wind that strikes the magnetic envelope of the Earth and the ionosphere, makes it vibrate, and that's where the sounds from space come from, the NASA space sounds that I've got. The interaction of the solar wind, charged electromagnetic particles, the fourth state of matter, plasma, interacting with the ions of the ionosphere and creating a vibration that we can hear, that we can record. And what does it sound like? It sounds like dolphins and whales and birds and crickets and choirs singing and Tibetan bowls. It's just sort of mind-blowing. Anyway, according to Konstantin Maya, the core of the planet is not solid. Here's this original continent. As the Earth expands its size, these continents come apart from each other. The original in the center expanded out. So what he's saying is that these neutrinos have an affinity towards this fourth state of matter, that the fourth state of matter, plasma, actually interacts with neutrinos in an electromagnetic way. They're attracted and captured by the plasma field. Not completely, not 100%, but way more likely. So what's happening is that the neutrinos coming from the sun are being trapped in the plasma core of Earth, that the pressure and the temperature of the core of the Earth is so immense and so gigantic that it can't actually exist as a solid iron core. It exists as iron in a plasma state, sort of a quasi-liquid, superheated, gaseous sort of fourth state of matter state, which, because of its high energy, is able to interact with these neutrinos. And the neutrinos get trapped there. And since the neutrinos now are discovered to have a small amount of mass, that mass is building up. And as the mass builds up, that is what is expanding the planet's size and diameter. The planet is literally blowing up like a balloon because of the constant stream of neutrinos getting trapped in the core of the planet in its plasma iron ball. It's expanding and expanding and expanding over, hundreds of millions of years it takes this process to take place. So that's one kind of strange theory of our little joyride through crazy theories right now. The other one has to do with a book I read years ago, a sci-fi book called the HAB Theory. And the HAB was the name of the scientist who developed this theory. And this sci-fi book is an example of a series of sci-fi books that I enjoy, which are called hard science sci-fi. Arthur C. Clarke was famous for doing that, making highly educated scientific treatises, not as scientific papers published in journals, but as raw, intelligent ideas that should be explored and carry scientific weight behind them. And so it is with the HAB theory. So in the HAB theory, essentially, before I begin this, the HAB theory was the idea that the Earth periodically flips on its axis. Now, we've heard of the poles switching, the north-south pole switching. There's evidence that that may be happening soon with our planet right now. But that's different than this, what he's talking about. He's talking about the Earth itself flipping over to its side and displacing all the continents and all the oceans and causing a major planetary catastrophe where all life would pretty much be wiped out except for a couple of spots. And to flesh that theory out, hot air rises from the hottest areas of planet Earth, which is at the equator. And the ocean water at the equator is the hottest. Therefore, it evaporates the fastest. And the evaporated water molecules go up into the atmosphere from this zone here. And they traverse and make their way towards the coldest zone, which is the poles, through a series of these cells. But eventually, this hot air is going up into the atmosphere and making its way all the way to the poles, where it's coldest, and then gets recirculated back out to the equator, where it's heated up, and this whole cycle is constantly going all the time. And because the planet is rotating around, then it's not a straight path from here up to here, it's a spiral path, and that's the trade winds. The trade winds are the spiral path of the air molecules traveling from the equator to the poles, with the spin of the Earth taken into account. So as the moisture from all of this evaporation goes into the atmosphere, as it makes its way towards the poles and it goes over ever more cool land masses, it condenses and falls as rain. But the lion's share of the condensation dropping out of the atmosphere down to the planet Earth happens at the poles, and it happens as snowpack. So there's a continual mass of snow building up on the north and south poles that continues over thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. More and more and more and more snow is deposited on these poles, and that snow has weight. The North Pole is an ice pack. There's no land there. The South Pole, here, Antarctica, is a continent. And the snow deposited on this continent is continual and has weight. And it's like lowering a heavy rock, a boulder, into a pool of stiff mud. As it slowly lowers into that mud, the mud underneath that rock is getting squeezed out from underneath it to the sides and forming ridges. And on the continent of Antarctica, this mass of the snowpack is squeezing the land out from underneath it and forming a ridge of mountains all the way around the perimeter, just as you would think it would do with the mud squeezing out and forming ridges. These ridges are now mountain ranges. And we can see here, this elevation here, the purple is the highest elevation, and so we can see the purple highest elevations are this mountain range all the way around the outside of this continent, with the highest point in the middle. And that's trapping this snowpack. And there's a couple of places where it breaks free, and we have calving, where huge walls of the ice break off and go off into the sea. That's the pressure valve releasing. However, there's not enough pressure valves to release the amount of snowpack that continually deposits and continually forms higher mountain ranges that hold it in place so it can't escape. And this is the core of the HAB theory. Because the continent of Antarctica is so asymmetrical, you see how asymmetrical this is. This part over here has a lot more weight than it does over here. And therefore, here's the South Pole, and the spin of the Earth is here. So we have a weight that's off-center that's getting heavier and heavier. And what that's doing is it's causing the Earth to wobble. There's this wobble off of its center point because we have an off-center weight from the South Pole, from the spin point. And it's getting heavier. Therefore, the wobble is getting bigger. And in the turn of the century, when the first expeditions traveled all the way to the South Pole, one of the things that they were there to do was to measure the exact location of the South Pole and the spin spot, and to measure the amount of wobble. And as they've measured the amount of wobble over the decades, the amount of wobble is obviously getting larger and larger and larger. When it was first measured in the turn of the century, it was something like 50 yards, and now it's a few miles. And so back to the HAB theory, where he was talking about the fact that this wobble getting larger becomes now sort of like the wobble that happens when a spinning top begins to destabilize. It starts to wobble back and forth. The wobble gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Pretty soon it flips over to its side. And that's what he's saying with the HAB theory is taking place. That the HAB theory means that the depositing of the ice pack is making the Earth wobble more and more and more until the wobble gets so exaggerated that it destabilizes and the whole planet flips over to its side. And when it does that, it wobbles back and forth a few times until it stabilizes. But imagine what it would be like for the entire planet to flip to its side. That would mean that all the oceans would be displaced onto land, and all the land would be torn apart in that motion, and then when it stopped, be squashed together, and then when it rotated back and forth over and over and over again, it would be squashed and ripped and squashed and ripped, and the oceans would be flying all over the place. All life as we know it would be extinguished, except for two spots on the planet. That's the spot of the new axis of spin. The new axis of flip has a line going straight to the planet this way. As it flips this way, there's 2 points on this side and on this side of the planet that are stationary. All they're doing is going in a circle, but they're not flipping at an acceleration. So life would continue at those two spots. And this was essentially the story of Atlantis and Lemuria, where the Earth flipped and everything was just extinguished. A high developed civilization was completely destroyed, and the survivals of the two flip points would have a lot of memories about cell phones and televisions and laser surgery and airplanes and spaceships, but it would only be a memory. None of them would have any of the knowledge to build any of these things, even if they were scientists. But most would be not scientists, and they'd be involved in the scrapping of survival, because you would be essentially back in the Stone Age and have to rebuild everything from the start. Anything from the previous civilization that happened to be in those two new spin points would survive. And this was said where the Egyptian civilization began, with the pyramids and all the rest, the surviving pieces. Where civilization had to rebuild itself. That the Stone Age people were actually people from a previous civilization, and in just 2 generations it would just be stories over a campfire about some hypothetical time in the past that eventually became mythology. So, according to the HAB theory, if the Earth flips over to its side, the big depression of the previous solid poles, in this case Antarctica, would have this big depressed area where the weight of the ice pack had squeezed the mountains out. There would be a big depression there. And when the Earth flips off to its side, the previous pole is now on the equator. And when the Earth flips over to its side, it has to start spinning at 90 degrees to what it was before. And there's a new equator of the hot zone, and there's a new poles that freeze over. And the previous poles are now at the equator area. And those begin the same process. Ice begins to build up on the poles until it begins to create a wobble, and the Earth will flip over and over and over and over again through the millennia. And each time it flips, there should be this characteristic depression of the previous pole. And from the HAB theory, looked through the planet to find these characteristic depressions and had found up to 40 of these from the past. Be that as it may, one of those depressions is Death Valley. And I went to Death Valley on my 49th birthday. 49, by the way, is the one, not 50, because it's the seventh octave, which is the grand mystical door opening in your consciousness. So pay attention when you're 49 and do something special, because it's the mystical birth date. I went to Death Valley, particularly to stand at the lowest elevation point in this half of Earth, 290 feet below sea level. There's an ancient seabed there that's filled with salt. It's a salt bed from an ancient ocean. The ancient ocean, of course, would have been the ice pack that had pressed down, and then when it flipped, created an ocean, which eventually evaporated, and now is 290 feet below sea level, and it has no water in it. So how do you get 290 feet below sea level filled with salt if there hadn't been an ocean there? And where did that ocean come from, and where did it go? Anyway, Death Valley is mind-blowing because it's got these multicolored canyons, obviously cut by water from the melt when the planet flipped. And so, according to him, we're already 10,000 years overdue for the planet to be flipping. So we're living on borrowed time. And why hasn't the planet flipped? What is preventing it from flipping? Why hasn't it flipped up to this point? And that's because of a little interesting phenomenon created by us called global warming. So as the planet is heating up because of all of the pollution activities that we have done and carbon emissions into the atmosphere that are causing a greenhouse effect, the poles are actually melting. And that is offsetting the depositing of the snowpack on the continent of Antarctica and has stabilized the Earth's wobble. So that means that the bad news about global warming is actually good news for the planet itself, because as the poles are melting, the wobble is stabilizing, and we don't want too much to melt or we have another problem. So it seems that we're all stuck between a rock and a hard place. The one is the natural progression of an increased wobble that makes the Earth flip and extinguish all life. And now there's the life that we have arisen, our technological life that's new, that has created our own problem by screwing around with things that we haven't thought about. And the consequence of that is the destruction of the ecosystem through global warming. But it turns out that that happens to be a positive thing to balance a natural influence of destroying all life on the planet through flipping with the HAB theory. So right now we're in this perfect little steady state where once again we're in this place as human beings where it's necessary for us to wake up, form a symbiotic core, reintroduce with the planet, and use our technological know-how to balance this steady state so that all of this is happening for a larger, more grand purpose than we're aware of. It's all part of a universal plan. Either you wake up or you die. It's either you wake up to the fact that you're destroying the planet's ability to support your life form, or you do nothing and the Earth flips. So once again, it's up to us to put our magic hats on, work together, align ourselves together to make this thing happen. Because it's the evolution of our species and life on Earth that is at stake here. The the planet that is our home, our Mother Earth, the real meaning of Pangaea, which now we call Gaia. Pangaea is the ancient mother. This is our home, this little blue rock someplace in the middle of nowhere. It needs to evolve through us into a new dispensation that forms a new birth of something that has never been seen before, where Earth becomes a new thing, magnetized and energized by our symbiotic alignment of consciousness, planet-wide with all living beings. That's the place that all of this sort of needs to go. And with that said, once again, we take our headphones out because we're going to have an experience of aligning ourselves together with this kind of vision. So here we go. Headphones on, eyes closed, and here we go. So here is where you can get the soundtrack. You know, all of these soundtracks are designed to play your body as well as your mind. That's why I developed a sound table to play that portion as a physical experience through all of your cells. It would be really something to hear all these soundtracks that you've collected through your body in the way it was originally designed. This website, let me just get rid of this here. This website, our regular website, or this website, but basically this website, because in honor of 2021, that we've made it through 2020, we have a sale on our sound tables, 20% off, and it's good through the till midnight tonight. It's been going for a week. You may have seen the ads we put on social media, but if you decide you want to do that, contact us. You don't have to pay tonight, but let us know you want it, and you will have the 20% discount. The only ad you will ever see from me for a product. So thank you all for making it this far, and it's my honor and privilege to be here with you all each one of these Sundays. And so until next Sunday, be good and